Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. So this is the first episode in a special mini-series highlighting the work of the Sacred Writes Public Scholarship on Religion cohort of 2019. Sacred Writes provides support, resources, and networks for scholars of religion committed to translating the significance of their research to a broader audience. The reason this matters is because as a high school teacher whose job it is for me to distill the big ideas and complexity of academic research down into digestible forms for young people, I need groups like Sacred Writes. I admire their work and their mission. Sacred Writes helps people like me understand the hard work of the academic community for those of us who are outside of it, but who also care about new and big ideas within the humanities. So since I have gained so much knowledge from the public scholarship of Sacred Writes cohort members, I decided to invite each member of the cohort to appear across the next 9 episodes. These special conversations are woven together by the thread of the importance of public scholarship. So my first guest in this Sacred Writes series is Dr. Tia Noelle Pratt. Dr. Pratt is a higher education professional, researcher, and inclusion and diversity specialist based in Philadelphia. She got her PhD in sociology from Fordham University, and she is a sociologist of religion and an expert in systemic racism with experience researching and writing about how systemic racism impacts AfricanAmerican Catholics. So in this conversation, we discussed 2 of Dr. Pratt's public scholarship articles. First, we discussed the article Black Catholics, Racism, and the Sex Abuse Crisis, released in March 2020 from The Revealer, which is a fantastic magazine. Second, we discuss There is Time for the Church to Support Black Catholics if it has the will to do so, which was released in September 2019 from America, the Jesuit Review. So, as a lifelong Catholic, Dr. Pratt discusses her personal Catholicism, her academic research and writing within Catholicism, and also the uneasiness and tension she has felt over the years as she has researched and written about Catholic sex abuse crises and systemic racism within the Church. Both articles discussed in the episode are in the show notes, just in case that you would like to do any pre- or post-reading involving the contents of this episode. To learn more, you can follow us all on social media. You can find Dr. Tia Noelle Pratt on Twitter at TiaPhD. You can follow Sacred Writes on Twitter at Sacred_Writes. And you can follow me on Twitter at Classical_Ideas. So without further delay, here is my conversation on African American Catholic identity, systemic racism, and the sex abuse crisis with Dr. Tia Noelle Pratt. Dr. Tia Pratt, welcome to Classical Ideas.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
It's a delight to have you. Can you spend a moment and introduce yourself to the audience however you see fit?
Sure. So I am Tia Noelle Pratt, and I am a sociologist of religion. And basically what that means is I use the tools of sociology to study religion. So I'm not a theologian, but theology and the work of theologians figure prominently in what I do. And specifically, my focus is on systemic racism in the Catholic Church and how that racism impacts African American Catholic identity.
Excellent. How did sociology and religion come to be combined areas of academic interest for you? What's the backstory of how you converged on these 2 areas?
So really, the 2 came together towards the end of my undergraduate days. I was a sociology major as an undergrad, but I had a real interest in religion. And initially, I didn't know that as a sociologist, I could study religion. I thought I might have to veer off into theology. But that's really one of the challenges of the discipline, is that undergraduate students rarely get exposed to sociology of religion. So one of the things that really interested me in both bringing sociology and religion together and in the work that I've wound up doing basically ever since is that I grew up in started off in a predominantly African American parish. And so the idea that there were both African American folks and Catholic folks um, it made perfect sense to me because that's who my family was. That's what I saw growing up in the parish. But as I got more involved in sociology, as my interest in religion grew, I realized that in most spaces, both public spaces and academic spaces, being both Black and Catholic were seen as a disparate identity. And I knew that it wasn't. And so I set out to make that clear in both academic and public spaces.
Interesting. Okay, where did you grow up in the country, if I may ask?
Sure, I grew up in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia is still one of the key places where you find a strong contingent of African American Catholics, where we have parishes that are predominantly African American. There are fewer now than there were when I was growing up, but we still have them in much of the country. There aren't necessarily enough African American Catholics in one place to comprise a predominantly Black parish, but in Philadelphia there are.
Gotcha. Are there any estimates about how many African American Catholics there are in the United States? That is totally unfamiliar to me.
So, according to the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, there are 3 million Black Catholics in the U.S., and that number encompasses African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, and African immigrants, but does not usually include Afro-Latinos, who are more often included with the Latinx population.
Excellent. Is this nationwide too, or like, because you mentioned Philadelphia being sort of like a large area for African American Catholics? So what are some of the other hot spots around the country where African American Catholics tend to live more?
Sure. Chicago, New York, New Orleans, Baltimore are some of your key hotspots. Really, all of Louisiana. Chicago, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York. Those are some key places.
Gotcha. Okay. Good for demographic knowledge. I like that. So you and I were brought together sort of on this project that I'm doing with the Sacred Rights Public Scholarship Group. And you are a 2019 fellow for Sacred Rights in Religion, and it's now 2020. But I'm interested how and why you became interested in pursuing this particular opportunity with this public scholarship group in religion.
So it was really a lot of different things coming together. I realized that we didn't really have a lot of sociologists participating in public discourse. And I thought that was a real absence. I mean, I could feel the absence of a sociological perspective in public discourse. And religion is something that is really underappreciated in public discourse in the way that religion influences how our society functions, whether it's in the realm of politics or policy or the decisions that people make in their everyday lives. And I would see scholars who, something would happen. There would be something in the news, and the next day they would have an op-ed about it in the newspaper. And I wanted to know how they did that. I wanted to know how, because my own writing, it would take so long to develop that by the time I would get something together, the news cycle had passed and had moved on to something else, or maybe 2 or 3 other things. And so when this opportunity came up, I really saw it as a way to make connections, because not only did I not know really how to do that, how to kind of translate what I work on and think about all the time to a public audience. I didn't know, even if I had something, how do I get it to the newspaper? How do I get it to a particular magazine that's looking for something right away? And so this, when I saw this opportunity with Sacred Rights, it really seemed like a way to do that, to bring all those things together.
I love it. It seems like you have all this knowledge in your head that you study for so many years, and the peer review process can slow so much down with regards to getting what you're finding out into the world. So this seems like a perfect sort of compromise, right?
Right. Yeah. And that's really exactly what I was thinking about. And there's something wonderful about writing something and submitting it, and you see it in print in hours or days rather than weeks or months, which is what happens with the peer review process.
Absolutely. So I've been reading some of your work this week, and it's very honest, it's very personal, and you openly write in your work about being Catholic and your experiences of being Catholic. What do you love about Catholicism? And I start off with that question because we're going to talk about some conflict that you feel as well. But I'm curious what you love about Catholicism and what sustains you within your tradition.
Well, first, thank you for reading my work.
You're welcome.
We write and send things out into the world, and then I often wonder, does it just lay in the void? But to know that it gets read is wonderful. That really is a question that I struggle with, and that's something that has come out in the writing over the last year or so. The things that I love about Catholicism, it really is tied to being a sociologist. I love the organizational rhythm of Catholicism. I love the ritual of practice and of Mass, and what sustains me is, that's more kind of like a everyday practice ritual type thing. But what sustains me, especially with these more difficult things that have come out in the writing, is some of the core theology of Catholicism. The core theology of Catholicism, of the Eucharist being the body and blood of Christ, being the true presence, and to receive the Lord in the Eucharist and to be at one with my Lord in that most sacred and intimate way. It is sustaining. It is comforting, especially in times of conflict, of frustration, be it, the issues that are facing the world we live in right now, or just the issues that I face as a scholar who studies the tradition that I'm a part of.
See, that's really interesting to me because, growing up Catholic, you didn't have to become a scholar looking into Catholicism. Like, you could have studied anything. But I feel like that your experience is so unique in that you research the religious tradition that you personally adhere to, which seems somewhat unique and as if it may come with some serious internal challenges. And so, all researchers have a story about how and why they do what they do on any given day and any given year. And it's intrinsic that drives a lot of people's academic work. And so you research, as you mentioned earlier, and write about systemic racism and sex abuse in the Catholic Church. So what got you interested in researching the Catholic Church in the first place as a scholar, given that you were already an insider in the tradition?
Well, one thing, and you mentioned, studying my own tradition. And I remember being in graduate school and a professor said to me, well, you can't study your own tradition. Mind you, a colleague of his who wound up being my dissertation mentor was also Catholic and studied Catholicism.
Mm.
But in that moment, I just looked at him and said, "Watch me," and I got up and walked away. Um, but I do think there is something that is very essential and important, especially when you're doing religion and about studying your own tradition, because otherwise there is the great risk, which I see a lot in scholarship on Catholicism done by non-Catholics, and scholars who wind up coming across like they're explaining the Statue of Liberty to New Yorkers.
Mm.
And, being in the tradition for my entire life, it gives me a perspective that those who are not part of the tradition wouldn't have. What really got me into studying Catholicism was this point of realization that there were so many people, both in public spaces and scholarly spaces, that thought being Black and Catholic didn't go together, and I knew that just wasn't true. And so I set about to break that myth single-handedly if I had to.
Gotcha. So some of the topics that you write about are very challenging: sex abuse, systemic racism, and this is one of those things to where I'd imagine that studying these topics has pushed your ability to be deeply associated with Catholicism in many ways. Mm-hmm. How did these issues of sex abuse and systemic racism within the institution come to grab your interest?
So, well, I'll start with the systemic racism piece. I was in graduate school and trying to really figure out what it was that I was doing. I felt like I was spinning my wheels a bit, was doing all of this work and couldn't really explain it to anybody in 3 sentences or less.
Yeah, the elevator speech in academia, right?
Right. And I was at a department colloquium when I was in graduate school, and I was doing that, spinning my wheels, talking about my work. And a professor said, "I think what you're really saying is identity." And it was a revelation. And so that's where the identity piece came in. And as I continued to move on through the work, I realized that I couldn't talk about African-American Catholic identity without talking about systemic racism. Because so much of African-American Catholics' experiences are tied to systemic racism in the church.
Can you give me an example of sort of like what that looks like within the church?
Sure. I mean, that looks like so many things that and things that don't exist in a vacuum. We can start with the church as an institution and its ties to slavery. We can look at religious communities like the Jesuits and the Vincennes and their ownership of slaves, and what does that mean? We can look at communities like the Josephites and the work of people like Father Slattery to create a Black priesthood within the United States, because he knew that if there wasn't one, that there weren't going to be significant numbers of Black Catholics in the U.S. And yet there was his work, as progressive as it was hindered by his own paternalism. Issues of Black folks who are Catholic being denied admission to Catholic colleges and universities. The fact that we have, to this day, so few Black priests in the United States, and Black men who were not admitted to the seminary outwardly for so long. And even now, there's still so much racism and difficulty that Black seminarians experience. Um, so, and that leads us to things that we see today with the low numbers of African Americans in the priesthood and religious life at our Catholic colleges and universities. None of this exists in a vacuum. There's a line to be drawn between all of these things that I just mentioned, and the sex abuse piece is more recent. That came about more recently. Actually, the Associated Press has an ongoing series called The Reckoning, where they're looking at the sex abuse crisis in the Catholic Church from the perspective of race. And a colleague, Dr. Brian Clates, who is another Sacred Rites cohort member, and he spends a lot more time with the sex abuse crisis. And so when the conversations began to turn to race, he directed the folks from the AP to me. And so I started talking with them and thinking about it more. And then I was asked by Dr. Brett Krusich, who's the editor of The Revealer. He's another cohort member of mine, and along with Brian, and to write about the sex abuse crisis from the perspective of race. And one of the things that an EP reporter told me was, in talking to survivors and going to events where survivors were present, that there were no people of color there. And it didn't seem like there could be no people of color amongst survivors. And I mean, of course that's the case. Of course, there are people of color amongst the survivors. So the idea of putting these things together came about really through those conversations. But that's been incredibly difficult. The work on systemic racism is already difficult enough. The sex abuse crisis, I grew up in Philadelphia, as I've said. And so the sex abuse crisis hit Philadelphia very deeply. There were 2 large-scale grand jury investigations in Philadelphia that exposed so much and of what had been going on for decades. And there were, as I wrote about in the piece in The Revealer, there were a number of those who were accused in that first grand jury report back in 2005 that had been assigned to my home parish. So to know, and they were assigned to my home parish after the archdiocese had been made aware of accusations against them. So they knew what they were doing when they sent them to my parish.
Gotcha. Well, and you've got these 2 articles that I just read too. So you have a March 2020 from The Revealer called Black Catholics, Racism, and the Sex Abuse Crisis. And then you also have a 2019 one called There is Time for the Church to Support Black Catholics if it has the will to do so. And a question that I'm wondering is, you write in your work about sitting down with and listening to stories of people for whom this institution has failed. What are some stories that they've told you? Well, all that's going to be in my book. Oh, good. But there are stories of older people, especially. I mean, who have told me about at their first communion as second graders at the first communion, that all of the white children were allowed to come up and receive their first communion, and it was only when they were done and returned to their seats could the 1 or 2 black children in the group be able to receive their first communion.
being, essentially cast aside in that way as a small child, that leaves a mark. These are people in their 80s who describe this as if it happened last week. The pain of losing one's parish. When churches close and parishes are reorganized, that is a deep issue. There is a culture in Philadelphia in particular, certainly not exclusive to Philadelphia, but very much in Philadelphia, that the parish is your home. It's your lifeblood. It's where everything happens, and to lose that is a big deal. One of the things that I often say is that, when we talk about the church, we can talk about the church in a number of ways. Cardinal Avery Dulles talked about 5 different ways in which, ways of describing the church. And certainly we can talk about the church as the people of God, and that is more than just a building. But when the big moments of your life, literally from birth to death, happen in that building, and in some families happen in the same building for generations, it is a very big deal when that building's not there anymore.
Yes. So, there's another detail that you just mentioned earlier about how priests with credible allegations against them are sent to communities of poor African American and Native Catholics as well, you mentioned. And in the work, you document a story of one family who, is able to receive minuscule settlements after suffering years of abuse in their diocese. I'm curious how, much has been made of settlements, sex abuse settlements in the church for the last, however many years. How do settlements for abused poor people compare to those in more affluent communities?
So with the family that I mentioned in the Revealer piece, and their story was first documented in the Reckoning series in the AP, the Love family, it wasn't just about the fact that they're poor. It was about the fact that they're poor and Black. Because there's documentation showing that low-income white survivors still receive more than poor or low-income Black survivors. So it's not just about having a good attorney, being able to afford a good attorney, or having some kind of insider knowledge about how all of this works. So when there's evidence of that, it's not just about their socioeconomic status. It's also about race. It's about the fact that they are less than, even in their status as survivors of these horrific crimes. They're still less than because they're Black.
In the work, you write about sort of describing yourself almost as like a professional agitator, because you are still Catholic, but you know about so many of the uglier sides of the institution from the last however many years. How do you not leave? And what do you see as your role in openly speaking up about this while also calling yourself sort of a professional agitator? Because I really liked that.
Yes, a professional agitator, or I make people mad at me for a living. So what keeps me here is, it differs from day to day, and to be honest with you, some days I don't have an answer. But as I wrote about in the America piece from last September, I do have faith that the church can be its better self, even if it has to get there without me. but I do believe strongly in working to change institutions from within those institutions, because there's only so much that can be done from the outside when you're, on the outside banging on the door. You've got to be in the room. You've got to be at the table. That's incredibly important if there's going to be real change, real structural change that moves, the needle away from systemic racism and towards racial justice. How does it happen? It changes from day to day. I look at my family, my friends, my students, my life in this church, and ultimately I have come down to on the side of I'd rather be here than anywhere else.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any?
No, that's quite right. I also, some days I also feel like I've got one foot out the door. But yes. So that.
And you write about, hoping that better Catholic Church will emerge, and it seems hopeful. Do you have any specific ideas for like policies or goals or initiatives you feel like the church could start right now, this year, that would quell some of your discomfort and engage you so deeply that you might want to like join up in some kind of like leadership to help further these agenda items for making the church a better place for all Catholics?
Well, there is a number of ways that can happen. One is just owning up to the issues that I've mentioned. When I mentioned earlier, kind of drawing that line and coming down on the side of the things that we're looking at today don't happen in a vacuum. There is a piece for America a few months ago by Olga Marina Segura, who talked about essentially a 1619 project for the church.
Interesting.
And that's something that I would be very excited about. There are a number of different ways. We have to look at things like in our schools, at admissions practices, hiring practices. If we look at our Catholic schools, and especially the ones that are in neighborhoods that serve almost exclusively, if not exclusively, Black and brown children, and yet the people who are educating those children are not Black and brown, then we have to ask why. And then we have to take steps to make sure that can happen. We have to, so things like hiring practices, things like, discipline in schools, disciplinary procedures. Are white children and Black children treated differently for the same infractions? And if they are, then that needs to be addressed. Looking at real structural issues in our institutions are ways that the needle can move.
So you mentioned a book earlier. Tell me about your
Yes.
next plans for keeping that needle moving for yourself.
So I am working on hopefully getting close to finishing a book on these issues of systemic racism and AfricanAmerican Catholic identity. So that's what I'm working on right now, in addition to my public scholarship. And my work, it sustains me, but it also challenges me. And sometimes I'm sitting at my computer typing, and I think to myself, I'm going to lose my religion writing this book. And that's really kind of what inspired the America piece for back in September that you mentioned earlier. I was sitting at my computer thinking, I'm going to lose my religion writing this book. But the work is important, and it still has to get done. So really what I'm working on. So the book looks at a few different things. It ties together a few different things. It kind of connects the dots of systemic racism and how these things don't exist in a vacuum. It looks at liturgy as a form of identity work for African American Catholics. And the section that I'm working on right now is about St. Peter Claver Parish in Philadelphia, which was the first parish in Philadelphia to minister exclusively to African Americans. This is a parish that was founded by Black Catholics at the end of the 19th century because they weren't welcome in established parishes in the diocese, and yet remained devoted in their Catholicism and remained desirous of a church home. And so that actually helps keep me going too, to know that those first parishioners of St. Peter Claver didn't have laws on their side, whether people kept to them or not. They didn't have laws on their side the way that I do, and yet they kept going. They were insistent on having their church. That's a very big deal.
It is, and it honors the untold or undertold history of that particular parish, I think.
Yes, absolutely.
Fantastic. Well, Dr. Tia Pratt, where can people find you if they want to know more about what you do, follow you, find your work, etc.? Where are you?
So I thank you for asking. I have a website, tiapratt.com.
Excellent.
And I'm also on Twitter at Tia PhD. So those are two very easy and accessible places to find me.
And for anybody listening, I will link to the articles that we've discussed today from America and from the Revealer, and also link to the website and the Twitter links. So you can find those in the show notes, dear listener. So, Dr. Tia Pratt, thank you so much for coming on Classical Ideas to chat about your work. I look forward to following you in the future.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I enjoyed our conversation.
Classical Ideas is produced by me, Greg Soden. Music on Classical Ideas is composed and performed by Derek Strybig. You can find his music at www.wearewarmmusic.com. If you like this show, please rate it on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can email me at classicalideas@outlook.com, or find me on Patreon at patreon.com/classicalideaspodcast. Thanks so much for listening.